sa Pilipinas ang 2019 novel coronavirus.
When pandemic hits the world, socializing and learning just came to a huge halt. With the phenomenal rise of e-learning and teaching remotely on digital platforms, our lives transformed to follow a new normal. It made us our new way to chat, share files, and work together. We, the future teachers, with burning passion and dedication, will immerse ourselves in a virtual classroom and experience the new learning environment. Chat together, plan together, get together. With our team, there's always a way.
Good day everyone, I am Aljon J. M. Quirante and we are the third group from Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Social Studies. In this presentation, we will talk through the Activity 5, Assessing of Learning Outcomes and Reporting Feedback. Intended learning outcomes refer to the capabilities of the learners, what they should know or what they can do after the discussion. Learning outcomes describe the knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, or values that the students should be able to demonstrate at the end of the lesson. Why do we need to assess learning outcomes? The assessment of learning outcomes provides information and data that can be the basis for teachers to come up with the different strategies, approaches, or techniques that they will be able to carry out in the succeeding lessons. And next is reporting feedback. Feedback is crucial to the learning process of the students. In fact, effective feedback assists the learners to reflect on their own learning and their learning strategies so that they can make adjustments, even those smaller adjustments, to make better progress in their learning.
Before we dive into the discussion, let us first look into the intended learning outcomes. At the end of this activity, the FS students must be able to achieve the following intended learning outcomes. 1. Determine the alignment of the assessment tools and tasks with the intended learning outcome. 2. Critique traditional and authentic assessment tools and tasks for learning in the context of established guidelines on test construction. 3. Evaluate non-traditional assessment tools including scoring rubrics. 4. Determine the procedure on how grades are computed and reported to parents. And 5. Compute student grade based on DepEd's grading policy. Prior to intended learning outcomes, I gladly introduce to you my hard-working teammates who collaborated and participated in order to come up with the ideas and answers that will be tackled later on in this presentation. Here we have Mr. Allyson Gregorio, Miss Mica Imperial, Mr. James Brian Prima, Mr. Jhon Edzel Milagrosa, Mr. Kenneth Charles Martin, Miss Junio, Miss Jessica Lamzon, Mr. John Kenneth Macasieb, Mr. John Darryl Malicdem, Mr. Michael J. Montemayor, and Mr. Roy Vincent Maniflor. Let's now move on to the first part of our activity, which is observation report. We observed a 9th grade class handled by Sir Melchor Orpilia, and our goal was to identify the different assessment tools he used throughout the discussion. Here we have a table with 3 columns: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. Assessment for learning or formative assessment can be done before, during, or after a discussion. it is recorded, however it is not graded. It's just used as basis for teachers for their enhancement or improvement of their teaching strategies. Assessment as learning is also called self-assessment. It can be done by the students. And assessment of learning or summative assessment is usually done after completion of a topic or after completion of a unit or a chapter. Okay. Under assessment for learning, we observe 3 different assessment tools used by Mr. Orpilla. We have Q&A assessment tool, fill in the blanks and providing feedback. Q&A assessment tool was used by Mr. Orpilla before the discussion. We observed that he asked a few questions to students to test their prior knowledge regarding the topics. It helped Mr. Orpilla to emphasize the words or illustrations that are new to the students. Next is fill in the blanks. Fill in the blanks was used after the discussion. Mr. Orpilla included this type of test for the students to test what they have learned. He extended this test by uploading the other questions on Google Classroom. Then last for formative assessment is providing feedback. We observed formative feedback as the discussion was being delivered. It helped Mr. Orpilla not only to assess the students' learning but also to alter the gap between the actual performance of the students and the desired performance, which is aligned with the intended learning outcomes. Those are the formative assessment tools. Let's move on to the self-assessment. Okay. Under the self-assessment, we have 2 assessment tools used by Mr. Orpilla. The first one is recitation. Recitation, this tool was used during the discussion. The lesson was about the nature, dimensions or types and consequences of power, which is wide-ranging to assess students' learning as the discussion goes along. Some of you might be wondering, how can recitation become a self-assessment? When we've noticed that after every topic or every terminologies that Mr. Orpilla discussed, he asked a few questions and he let the students to recite, to raise their virtual hands and state their own opinions. And so recitation becomes self-assessment because it makes the students to formulate or create their own questions out of the knowledge that they have absorbed during the discussion. That's why it's an example of self-assessment. And then next is formulating questions. This assessment was observed after the discussion when Mr. Orpilla asked the students if they had any questions or unclear thoughts regarding the topic, which is crucial to let the students inquire about their misunderstandings of the topic. It can help the learners assess how clearly the information got across. That is self-assessment or assessment as learning. Last is assessment of learning. Since assessment of learning or summative assessment is usually done after completion of a course or completion of a unit or a chapter, there was no assessment of learning observed, as we just observed a 1-hour class. We didn't observe the whole chapter, so there's no assessment of learning.
Which of the listed assessments are formative in nature? Justify your answer. From the listed assessment above, we think that the formative in nature is the assessment for learning. It is because AFL has been closely associated with a formative assessment since it practices questioning and providing of feedback. The listed activities above create feedback, which is then used to improve students' performance, and regarding to this assessment, we can see that students become more involved in their learning process, and we think they gain confidence in what they are expected to learn and to what standard. Also, it led to students' involvement in becoming more active in their learning and started to think like a teacher, based on what we have observed in the virtual class using the listed assessment above.
Number 2 questions. List all the summative assessment that you have observed. Why do you say so? After the class discussion, we noticed that Mr. Ophelia did not have the opportunity to provide a summative assessment to his students. The whole lecture was spent to his explanation of the topic, nature, dimensions, types, and the consequences of power. He only has the opportunity to publish a few questions that his students will respond. However, from what we understand, summative assessment include midterm exams, final exams, and final project or output. Summative assessment are provided to students at the end of an educational period and are delivered at the end of the course instructional unit.
This is James Brian Macaranas, Prima, and I was assigned to complete the table on what are the intended learning outcomes or objectives and what are the assessment activities done in our observation. For the first and second ILO, first, explain the nature of power. Second, characterize the different dimensions of power. It was non-tradition because the teacher asks his students about what the nature of power and the students responded to that question. For the third ILO, discuss the consequences of power. For this assessment activity, it was an essay answering the question what the consequences of power are. For the fourth ILO, analyze the nature, dimensions, types, and consequences of power. For this assessment activity, it was an essay answering the question what is the nature, dimensions, types, and consequences of power.
Speaking, Jhon Edzel P. Milagrosa. For the question number 1, what guidelines on test constructions and art of questioning did the teacher consider in each assessment activity? The answer: research tells us that questioning has a positive impact on student learning and is signature of outstanding pedagogical practice. During the observation, we noticed that all of the prepared questions are aligned and congruent to the intended learning outcomes of the lessons. Throughout the discussion, Mr. Ophelia often used valuing as the art of questioning. He takes time to truly listen to the questions asked by his students, and he showed them that their questions and thoughts are matter and are valuable to their class discussion and learning. Value of time is also present in each assessment activity. In every question, his students have the time to pursue their curiosity thinking, and they have the opportunity to organize their thought and to look at ideas in different ways. This practice performed by Mr. Ophelia will help his students to increase their confidence in responding to questions, and his students will develop their critical thinking skills and communication skills.
Hello everyone, I am Darryl C. Malicdem, and here are the proofs of our interview with the teachers. We conduct a face-to-face interview but still observing minimum health protocols. We also conduct audio and video calls, and some conduct textual interviews. For this question, we consider the interview of Mr. Kenneth Charles Martin with Mr. Talong G. Cheng, a Special Science Teacher 1, since our interview is somewhat same with them.
Here is the result of my interview. The abrupt shift of educational setup posed lots of challenges in the learning of the students. The physical absence of MKOs or more knowledgeable others makes learning difficult compared to the former face-to-face classes where teachers are physically present to facilitate their learning. Assessing their learning outcomes becomes difficult as distance learning has lots of consideration to be taken into the account to provide fair, objective, and humanitarian assessment to the students. According to Teacher Cheng, as a deputy teacher in the new normal setup, I have to consider the mental health and socioeconomic status of my students. I ease up my subject requirements by allowing them to answer only 2 activities per module and grade them using rubrics. I only record the activity with highest score. I ensure that the activities in the module are objectively aligned with the most essential learning competencies provided by the DepEd. According to DepEd Order number 31 series of 2020, there will be no quarterly assessment to be done, but instead summative assessments will be given on a regular basis. I give summative assessments every 2 weeks to check for their learning. Performance tasks are given every 4 weeks or after 4 weeks, and these are graded using the rubrics I develop. I consider the availability of materials and space, attainability, and timeliness of every student in designing my performance activity. The outputs of the students are either passed through barangay drop boxes or sent via messenger. The performance of the students are reported to the parents through our quarterly card day, where their report cards are sent to them through drop boxes, messenger, or email. For students lagging behind, a weekly report is done through phone call or messenger to inform them on the status of their children in school. We provide much consideration in our part to let them comply with the requirements as distance learning in our context in far-flung area is really challenging and stressful in their part. Learning is indeed a continuous process. No matter how learning is disrupted, we think of a way to let students learn to avoid time lag. As the pandemic rages on, we continue to innovate our strategies in order to keep students learning, at least in the very much possible way, with utmost consideration in their part.
To answer analyze number 1, why is there a need to evaluate learning? There's a need to evaluate learning because the overall purpose of evaluating learning is to determine the effectiveness of the learning and whether performance and business objectives were met. It also helps teachers and learners to improve teaching and learning. To answer question number 2, do teachers need to record results of formative and summative assessments? Why or why not? Summative assessments results are often recorded as scores and grades that are then factored into a student's permanent academic record. Whether they end up as letters grades on a report card or test scores used in college admission process. While formative assessment is used when students are learning, unlike summative assessment, it focuses on the process. The main objective of formative assessment is to improve students' learning and development. That's why grades and points are not important in formative assessment. In addition, research has been quite emphatic that grades and scores can interfere with a student's willingness to keep learning.
For the third question, in the assessment that was administered, do you think that the teacher prepared a table of specification? Elucidate your answer. First of all, when we talk about table of specification, it pertains to a tool that ensures the alignment between the items or elements of an assessment and the content, skills, or constructs that the assessment intend to assess. During our observation with grade 11 UMS, we noticed that the teacher didn't prepare a table of specification judging from the assessment he provided. Prior to the lesson, he presented 4 learning outcomes, which are all aligned to the domains of Bloom's taxonomy. However, as they proceed to the assessment part, which is a fill in the blank, they only settle to only one type of test, meaning it only measures one domain, which is the cognitive domain. Only if the teacher provided different types of tests which align to their content and learning outcomes, we could attest that he prepared a table of specification. Let's proceed to the fourth question. How did the teacher align the tasks in the assessment tools with the intended learning outcomes? As we proceed to our online observation, the teacher started the lesson by presenting their 4 intended learning outcomes which follow the Bloom's taxonomy domains, namely cognitive, psychomotor, and the affective domain. However, the assessment tool being employed by the teacher cannot absolutely measure or attain the listed intended learning outcomes, for the reason that they use constructed type of test, which is the fill in the blanks. Basically, their assessment tool fall under the paper and pencil test, and according to Kendall and Marzano 2012, this type of test is inadequate to measure all forms of learning, since it only measures the cognitive domain or the declarative knowledge. In connection to this, in order to assess the procedural knowledge of the students or their psychomotor learning, the teacher should employ specific tasks which allow them to perform or create products.
Hello everyone, I'm Jhon Kenneth G. Macasieb. For question number 5, did the teacher use scoring rubrics to evaluate the students' performance? Describe how it was utilized. My answer for that is, because we are now in virtual learning environment, I observed that the teacher did not show a scoring rubric to evaluate the students' performance. But we know that teachers have scoring rubrics to evaluate the students' performance. The teacher should always have a scoring rubric because it shows how their students are improving in their daily teaching, and here they base what else the student should improve on. Teachers use rubrics to support learning. Scoring rubrics are important because they clarify for students the qualities their work should have. Rubrics can help instructors more clearly identify strengths and weaknesses across an entire class and adjust their instruction appropriately. And according to Washtenaw Community College, a scoring rubric is an efficient tool that allows you to objectively measure students' performance on an assessment activity. Rubrics may vary in complexity but generally do the following: focus on measuring very specific stated learning outcomes. Use a range to rate performance.
Good day everyone, I am Darryl C. Malicdem and I am tasked to answer the number 6 and number 7 question of the analysis part of this activity. For the 6th question, did the learners encounter difficulty in answering the teacher's questions? Why or why not? Expound your answer. In this question, we both considered our observation with Mr. Orpilla and the interview with our teachers. They all encountered students who have difficulty in teacher's question. We can't deny the fact that there are slow learners who need time and some efforts to properly understand the lesson. Some students are also shy and just don't want to answer even if they know it. But based on what we observed and interviewed, you don't end up leaving them on an unanswered question. You need to have an art of questioning like rephrasing, altering, and revising the questions so that they can slowly answer it. You need also to be creative and have an engaging way of questioning your students. Did the teacher encounter challenges during the computation and reporting of grades to parents? If yes, what are these? Since Mr. Orpilla did not conduct yet a computation or reporting of grades in this semester, we just consider the interviews in this question. For them, computing grade is easy because you just type in Edzel and it will be automatically processed. The most challenging part is when there is a student who really have a high grade and there are students who have a failing grade. The problem is when they adjust those who have failing grades in order for them to somehow pass. The grade of the student that is high will also be adjusted to the point that it will become almost perfect. There are parents also who ask or have concerns about the grades of their child, but the teachers are prepared for the records and results of a student's performance.
And for the question number 1, as a millennial would-be teacher, how can the assessment process help you make learning more fun and more meaningful? As a millennial teacher, I would integrate an assessment tools that are related, appropriate, and applicable to the time and level of my students. Like for examples, the use of technologies in the assessment process. This would help me and my students to build a more fun and meaningful class assessment, and this tool would help my students to increase their interest and motivation to finish their given task. And for the question number 2, as a future teacher, how can you eliminate fear of assessment to your students given this new normal mode of teaching? Assessment is very important in a teaching learning process. It used to determine if there is a learning. As a future teacher, I will eliminate fear of assessment by following and compromising the principles of high-quality classroom assessment. By that, my students would not be bothered in answering their assessment or task. And also, I would make sure that before conducting the assessment, the instructions and guidelines are well explained and defined so that my students will easily understand and finish their assessment.
Hello everyone, my name is Vincent de Maniflor, and I am going to answer questions number 3 and 4. So for question number 3, if you are the teacher, what solution or solutions could you offer to address the challenges in evaluating students' performance and giving feedbacks? So when it comes to students' evaluation, the teacher should always be fair and just, regardless of who he or she is evaluating. The teacher should only compute for the grades that the students are obtaining based on how they perform in the class. No intervention and modification should be made to favor a certain student. Feedbacks will help students to improve and will serve as a motivation as long as it is given in a proper manner. Now for item number 4, our group came up with the sample computation of grades using the depth assessment guidelines. So we are going to compute for the written works and the performance tasks to determine Learner A's final quarterly grade. We can see in the table we have the highest possible scores and Learner A's scores. So Learner A got 18 out of 20, 22 out of 25, 20 out of 20, and 17 out of 20 for the written works. So he has a total of 77 over 85. And based on the transmutation table, 77 over 85 is equivalent to 91. And since we only need 50% for the written works, we are going to get the 50% of 91 for his weighted average, so we got 45.5%. Now for the performance task, Learner A got 12 out of 15, 13 out of 15, 19 over 25, 15 over 20, and he has a total score of 56 over 75. And based on the transmutation table, 56 over 75 is equivalent to 75 for his partial score. And since we only need 50% for the performance task, 50% of 75 is 37.5%. Now for the initial grade, we are going to add up his weighted averages, which is equivalent to 83. And 83, based on the transmutation table, is equivalent to 89. So Learner A got a final quarterly grade of 89.
Now for the summary. The evaluation of learning is a very important part in the teaching learning process. It is important to assess the students' learning in order for the instructor to determine areas that the students need to improve. Records of the students' performance are also important for transparency of the teacher and for an honest evaluation of the students' grades. Assessment will be used to determine whether the teaching learning process derived from the curriculum is effective, so the modifications and improvements can be administered for the betterment of the students.
Hello, I am Darryl Malicdem, and here are the evidences and documentation for the activity number 5. As you can see here, the Group 3 members are observing carefully and taking down notes for the domain number 5. Here are our interview with the teachers. Attached here are the assessment tool used by Mr. Orpilia for the lesson. Also attached here are the rubrics, sample computation of grades, and criteria for grading which are aligned to the DepEd Order number 31, series of 2020, or the interim guidelines for assessment and grading in light of the Basic Education Learning Continuity Plan. Here are the references used by our group in answering this activity. Thank you for watching.